Good, thank you. Good. Okay, 19th of October, Cleo's table. And this is a session on how to get internships and what to do, so that should be useful, 7 to 8 p.m. And also the history department, and while history, language, and global culture is having an open house on the 26th, which is the following Tuesday during activities period. There is going to be food, new rules for procuring food though, limited supply, so get there early. And we walk this fine line, encouraging people to come because there's food, and then the fear you're going to get there and it's all gone. So I'm not quite sure how to play that. Anyway, good. And I have been receiving your primary source assignments, which, or your ideas for them. The first stage is to find a source. Many of you have done that, which is good. And I will be giving more instructions as we go on. So stay tuned. Good. And any questions for me? Sorry, I realize I just gave you a very short and kind of, yes, Haley, you look like you're raising. Yes, Haley.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding right. Last class, I think you mentioned that for the next assignment as well, we can do the same topic. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're finding a primary source, you're also writing about some topic. So a number of you have said, I have this in mind, and then, which is fine.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Good. Any other questions? I see someone has a question in the chat. Do we just email you our topic? Yes, just email me your topic. That's been the easiest way to do it. Mitchell.
Yeah, I had the same question.
Okay, good. Okay, then let's, actually, I see by my schedule that right now we are where we should have been last week. And so, apologies, but last Wednesday we had a very good discussion of Adams versus Payne, and I wanted to continue on with that and actually move from that because something really interesting is happening here. In fact, between say 1776 and 1791, over this 15-year period, there is an extraordinary debate about the nature of government going on in the United States. And as I think you should know now that we've been talking about Montesquieu and David Hume and these other characters, that for a century or so before, there had been this debate going on about the nature of government. And we really see in these years between 1776 and 1791, in each of the American states, this debate going on not only as a philosophical thing, what's the best nature of government, but actually with each state creating a new form of government. And that is really the big story here. That's really the story of the American Revolution. It's not just getting free of the British Empire. It is then creating these new systems of government. And two of my favorite quotes, and I'm glad no one picked up on these from either Common Sense or John Adams's Thoughts on Government. Two of my favorite quotes are in each. In Common Sense, let me see. Should an independency be declared, should an independency be brought forward by the first of these means, by every, I'm sorry. We have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. Okay, so Payne has high hopes for whatever we do. We're going to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened before since the days of Noah until now. A new the birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all of Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the events of a few months. So extraordinary idea. We have it in our power to create the world over again. So it's not just we're now independent of Great Britain, but we are creating something new. And that's one reason why, in Common Sense, Paine goes to great lengths to talk about the proper form of government. You'll recall he wants a simple assembly. And the simpler anything is, the less likely it is to be, thrown out of whack. And he also says, he really, not only is he making a case against the king, he's making a case against the entire British Constitution, which was being held up in the 18th century as a model for a government. You have the Parliament really representing the people in two different ways. That is the House of Commons, House of Lords, and balancing the executive in the form of the king. And Paine is saying the whole thing is really nonsense. Not only nonsense, it's pernicious, this government. It might have done for the slavish and despotic age in which it was created, but no good anymore. Let's start over. That's really a radical in the real sense of the word. That is, you get to the root of something. So Paine, opportunity to create the world over again. You haven't seen anything like this since the time of Noah. And you recall, I don't know if you do recall Noah. Well, of course, none of us was around at the time of Noah. What's the story with Noah? Anyone want to fill in the rest of? Yes, Paul.
Basically, God flooded the world, and Noah took 2 of each animal onto an ark, and then he recreated the world from that point on. Exactly
right. Okay, so so the whole world had a chance to start over. It was a reboot, or whatever we would want to call it now. So Paine has great expectations for all of this. Now, our friend John Adams, and by the way, one of the reasons John Adams wrote his Thoughts on Government, 2 reasons. One, he was asked by some other members of Congress from New Hampshire and from South Carolina, because in each case, they needed a legitimate government. In Massachusetts, they could get away with saying, we'll just go about our business under the old charter and just simply say, the office of governor is vacant. In Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, everything required the king. That is, everything was in the name of the king. So suddenly you're not acknowledging the king. Well, what does that say about this government you have? So New Hampshire needed to do something. And so did South Carolina, because in South Carolina, there's a fight going on between those who want to remain loyal to the empire and those who want to break free. And of course, that's a relatively small part of the population of South Carolina. 60% of the people of South Carolina are actually enslaved. And so if they see that the people who own us are now fighting over who's in charge, 20% of the overall population on one side, 20% on the other, this is our opportunity. So South Carolina needed a legitimate government for very specific reasons as a way of keeping the enslaved population in order. So they also say, well, what should we do? And what Adams says in his Thoughts on Government is he advises how to form a government or what a government should look like. And Adams, as we'll see, I'll be talking a lot more about Adams probably than any of you had anticipated or asked for when you signed up for the class. Once this government, whatever government you create, has to somehow come out of our experience already. Unlike Paine, he's not saying, hey, we can just start over. He understands that we live in a society and we're not starting the society over again. Anyway, my favorite quote from Thoughts on Government: you and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to live. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government any more than of air, soil, or climate for themselves or their children. Think about that. We all are born in a certain place and we have a certain climate, certain atmosphere, and we really can't do anything about it. I guess we could move. And you don't have an opportunity to change that, nor do most people have an opportunity to change the kind of government they're living under. So this is at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to live, when before the present epoch, had 3 millions of people, full power and a fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive. So it's an opportunity for us. So Adams also sees that we have it in our power to begin the world over again, to make a choice of government here. And that's what you're going to see happening over these 15 years between 1776 and 1791 or so. So that's actually, we're going to be spending most of the rest of the semester talking about what seems like a limited number of years, but it's actually extraordinarily important in the history of government. And it has never since have so many people had this opportunity to do it. Well, maybe they have. I mean, we can argue about this and see how this bunch actually got it all wrong, but you can really see the way they are thinking very seriously about what is in store. So now in these different, well, let's just back up a bit. Any questions before I back up, go forward, back up again, move in some different direction, and leave us all completely baffled as to this work we're doing of creating the world over again? Well, the real work of forming constitutions is happening on the state level. You know, fast forward to 1786, so about 10 years or so after Adams is writing about the greatest lawgivers of antiquity, he writes a 3-volume work called Defense of the Constitutions of the United States. It's constitutions, it's plural. He is justifying the kinds of governments the Americans have created. And he's doing this in answer to a French critic, because one thing the Americans are doing, well, we'll start with so Adams is really thinking about the nature of government. He always is thinking about the nature of government, even when he is engaged in, hardball politics. He is a political philosopher in the sense that he understands how a political process works, which, as I think I mentioned last time, Paine really doesn't. Okay. Now, as the British government in America is collapsing, and as people in the American states are withdrawing their support from the established governments, they are also then creating new forms of government in each state. And it happens in a different way in each one. So I'm not going to generalize. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, does anyone know anything of importance that Thomas Jefferson wrote in terms of American history generally? I see. Matthew.
Didn't he write a report on the condition of religious views in Virginia in accordance to governance?
You're very good. Very good. Okay. He wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That's good. You really, I'm impressed that you know that very important thing. And it is one of the 3 things he wanted to have on his gravestone. So it is. Okay, there are 3 things on Jefferson's grave. One is he wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Yes, Paul, you have your hand up. Another thing Jefferson wrote?
He wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Right, the Declaration of Independence. That was one of the other 3 things he wanted on his grave. He also, did anyone know the 3rd thing he wanted listed? Yes, Mitchell.
The creation of the University of Virginia.
Very good. Okay, we've got the trifecta here. This is a good group. Okay, so Declaration of Independence, he writes it in May, June, July, 1776. And he was really kind of upset that he had to be stuck in Philadelphia writing this because he knew the real action was in Virginia. The Virginia Assembly, or what was left of the Virginia, now provincial Congress, it had been the Assembly. The governor had suspended the Assembly. The Assembly keeps meeting as the Congress. They draw up a constitution for Virginia. And Jefferson knew that was much more important and much more interesting to him than the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the Declaration of Independence is very important to all of us. less so to Jefferson until he realizes later how important it was. So Virginia is writing a constitution. The Virginia Assembly or Virginia Provincial Congress, and by the way, I'm trying to say this as simply as possible so you don't get confused about who is doing what, is drawing up a constitution that is a form of government for Virginia. And the form of government that Virginia draws up looks very much like the form of government Virginia had had before. There is an assembly or a house of burgesses, and then there is a council. And the problem they have is in who chooses the governor. There had been a governor before, chosen by the king. Now they decide, okay, well, the governor will be chosen by the assembly. Okay, but the important thing for the Virginia Constitution, and for those who are interested in it, the guy who does most of the work of drawing it up is George Mason. And we'll be talking more about Mason as time goes on. Mason, he's an interesting character, draws up the Constitution for Virginia. The really important thing about the Constitution of Virginia, aside from the way it structures the government, looking very much like the government that had been in place, is it begins with a Declaration of Rights. You know, if you're, and then having just said Declaration of Independence, not that important, there are a number of things that are very important about the Declaration. One is, well, you know, we all are familiar probably with the second paragraph of it, which is actually the most important for us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, that's well known. And by the way, Jefferson's not trying to create something new. This is just an announcement that he wants everyone to be able to agree to. Imagine today if someone said, we're going to draw up an agreement that everyone in the country will be able to say, yes, we agree to this. So that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Okay, let's just back up briefly. Why do we have governments then, according to the Declaration of Independence? What is the purpose of government or the end of government, according as we were talking last time? Yes, Giovanni.
According to Jefferson, it would be to protect the rights of the people.
Exactly, yeah. That, you know, we all have these inalienable rights and we create governments in order to secure these rights. Okay, so that's the fundamental thing here. So the Virginia Constitution begins with a Declaration of Rights. That is, why are we doing this? Because we have these certain inalienable rights. And what are they? And it lists them. It's about 30 or so articles in the Declaration of Rights. And the first one is that all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, which seems pretty straightforward. Although in the Virginia Constitution, we'll be talking more about this later on, because as the Virginia Assembly is talking about, yeah, we believe everyone has these certain inalienable rights. Well, it occurs to them that about 40% of the people in Virginia actually are born enslaved. So how then can we say all people have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, which cannot be taken away from them? Let me just see if I can get the language of this for you. One second. By the way, this is more of a philosophical discussion than I was hoping we would have. I was hoping we'd get really to what's going on with how these governments are structured, but useful just to think about. Let me see, here is the Virginia Constitution of 1776 and Declaration of Rights. It begins with the Declaration of Rights, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights of which they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So all men, by nature, equally free and independent, have certain natural inherent rights, and they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity of these rights. And then it goes on to say the right of enjoyment of life and liberty, the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And the guys in the Virginia Assembly, Provincial Congress say, wait a minute. 40% of the people in Virginia actually have been deprived of their right, of their liberty, right? So what can we do? Can we actually say this or not? And what happens in Virginia, does anyone know, by the way, what happens in Virginia? I mean, do they believe all men have these certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights? Siobhan's shaking his head, saying, doesn't think so, since 40% of the people in Virginia don't have these natural, essential, and inalienable rights. Well, what they do in Virginia is actually add a clause here that is that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. That is, they create a loophole here so that some people have at some point, when they weren't in a state of society, deprived their posterity of these rights. It's an extraordinary thing they're doing here. And I see it in a couple of, well, we can see it in many different ways. One, they are, well, now let me ask, since I'm kind of getting sidetracked here, anyone else see what they're doing? No one wants to venture any opinion on this. Yes, Jovan.
It seems like they're saying that so long as you're not a part of society, you don't have these rights, that you're fine to give away your rights. But it seems like it's making an exception for people who are freed later on. Like if you're a slave who's freed, then now you're a part of society, so your posterity can't be deprived. So it seems like it's sort of saying that, but I'm not sure if that was the real intention.
Well, I think you're on the right track. Yeah, Haley?
I was gonna say something similar. I sort of interpret it by saying like the slaves at the time did not have those rights, where other people did have those rights.
Okay, that's another way of putting it. Yes, Paul?
Yeah, so I view it as basically they're racially saying that African societies and societies in which they became enslaved and lost their rights aren't really societies, and they're more barbaric. And therefore, when they lost their rights in those societies, which aren't really societies in their view, they then are allowed to be slaves and deprived of their rights. And then when they entered into American society or European society, they continued to be deprived of those rights because they were initiated into society under a guise of non-society, if that makes
Okay,
sense.
it's an interesting way. Yes, V.
I'm interpreting that slaves were technically not considered part of society, as they were considered property and chattel and were already owned. So they had no rights from the beginning either way.
That's another way of putting it. But let me ask you this. If these guys writing this Constitution didn't believe that people who were enslaved were entitled to their rights, why would they put this in? Why are they making this argument? So that they can then say, we don't need, these folks don't have rights. I mean, if they knew, if they believed that they didn't have these rights, why are they going to all the trouble to say this? Yes, Matthew.
I think I might be jumping the gun a bit here, but I know that in a similar circumstance in Massachusetts, once Massachusetts state constitution was written, the preamble was used as a pretext for some enslaved individuals to sue for their freedom, because the language basically said that all residents of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are, have access to these rights.
Yeah. It's practically the same formula they use in Massachusetts. They don't have that, when they enter into a state of society. And it's that argument in 1782 and 3 that is going to lead a court to tell the jury that by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the people of the Commonwealth have agreed that all people who are all men who are, let me get the actual wording here if I have it handy. I didn't mean to get started with this. Yeah, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Very similar to what Virginia is saying. In fact, many of these state constitutions begin with a Declaration of Rights that says something very similar to this. In Virginia, they're making this argument that, and again, getting back to what Paul was saying, they're not doing a great deal of anthropological work or historical work to understand what are the nature of the societies in Africa they're coming from. They're just saying that at some point they'd agreed to give up their rights, and when they weren't in a state of society. But then that raises a question, which either Javon or Haley mentioned. Okay, so what happens when these people now are in a state of society in Virginia, or have become free in Virginia? Because at this time there is a push to for manumission of people who were enslaved. Well, what is their status then? Yeah, it's a question. Again, we're not going to solve this afternoon, but the fact that they're using this argument and saying all men are born free and equal, they're understanding this means all men are born free and equal, and not just saying, okay, this means us, it means all men. And we don't need to talk about women here. Well, that's a subject for another day, and I'm going to assign someone to tell us why women shouldn't vote or women shouldn't hold office and other arguments. Haley, you're nodding your head saying, I want to make that argument too, which would be really helpful. Otherwise, I was going to ask Mitchell to do that. But anyway, so you have this argument going on, but this is anyway, Declaration of Rights. And then they're thinking very seriously about what are the rights that should be protected, that we create a government in order to do. Okay, so as I said, Virginia draws up a constitution and then goes about its business having a governor chosen by the legislature. And then we'll talk more about this later on. Pennsylvania is a much more interesting place, well, in terms of this. And it's a long, complicated argument that happens in Pennsylvania over, I'll just say complicated series of political maneuvers. And what happens is those who were opposed to independence in Pennsylvania, there are folks opposed to independence, that is supporters of the Penn family, and for various reasons, they don't want to go along with independence. And there are also a relatively significant Quaker population in Virginia. And the Quakers, by terms of their religious beliefs, don't go to war, which means you're having a war and there's a significant part of the population that doesn't believe in fighting a war, which means that those who are fighting a war get really upset with these folks and kick them out of the assembly, which means you have a more radical group in charge in Pennsylvania, and they wind up in the summer of 1776 drawing up a state constitution for Pennsylvania, okay? Because there aren't the people who would oppose, the people who would oppose independence aren't there. Quakers aren't there. So you have the kind of radical folks there, and this is their opportunity. And what Pennsylvania does is really use Thomas Paine's idea for the best form of government, and they have a legislature, a single house legislature, okay? So you're not going to have a check on the legislature the way a lot of states like Virginia does. Virginia, you have a council to check the legislature. And other states do this, say, oh, you know, we should have a council because there's always been a council or some kind of an upper house checking things. We don't do that in Pennsylvania. Instead, you have a legislature. You also have an executive, but the executive is chosen by the assembly, which is what happens in just about every state, that the assembly chooses the executive. And in Pennsylvania, the executive is a council or a committee. And the thinking is we need some kind of an executive because the legislature isn't always going to be in session. And there may be some problem. So we're going to need to have some kind of an executive group, but we don't want to have a single person as the executive because that may lead to trouble. So you have a council, and then the presiding officer of the council is the presiding officer. He is called the president. In most cases, you know, there's kind of a question, what are we going to call the person in charge? In Virginia, they do call him the governor because there had been a governor. You know, Thomas Jefferson, by the way, he's not around to draw up the Constitution for Virginia. So he does draw up one of his own and says, this is what I would do if I were drawing up a Constitution. And Jefferson's model doesn't have a governor. Instead, he has an administrator to be the executive. You know, so think about that. Just think about the names of these things. There's someone who governs, someone who executes is the executive, or someone who presides, means he presides over a council, or someone who is the administrator. Who has more power just naturally? Governor, administrator, presiding officer, executive? Yes, Paul, you're raising your hand.
I feel like governor would have the most power because it seems just like innately by the word governor, it's governing. So
Yeah.
it has some aspects of executing laws, but also some aspects of creating and enforcing law.
Yeah, he governs. Okay, so he decides what to do. You have an assembly that draws up things, but then the governor governs. So in Pennsylvania, the executive officer is the president. Now we think president, that means this is someone who has a lot of power, but in 1776, the person who presides basically sits as a presiding officer. And for many years, actually, the president of Pennsylvania, for the last 5 years of his life, it's Benjamin Franklin. So he's in his 80s. So typically men in their 80s aren't usually actively going out doing things. And, you know, Franklin was pretty much retired, but he's not out of it enough that he can't be the presiding officer here. So, yeah, so it's different. So anyway, Pennsylvania has an executive council with a president, and they're also chosen by the legislature. So if the legislature is choosing the executive or the governor, and you typically, these guys serve for 1 year, who is really in charge? The legislature or the governor? In a case like Virginia, where the legislature chooses the governor every year, they vote on who should be governor. Who has power? Is it the governor or the assembly? Yes, Mitchell.
Sounds like the assembly.
Okay, Haley, you have a thought on this?
I agree.
Okay, yeah. Javon, anything to add to?
Yeah, I disagree. If the assembly is picking the governor, then
Yeah.
they kind of have power over the governor.
They do. Yeah, exactly. Because they remember one of the big problems that brought on the revolution was the fact that the governor was, because he was answerable to the crown, was vetoing things that the assembly wanted to do. Well, now we've gotten rid of the governor and the crown, so we'll just have the assembly running the show. This is what happens in Pennsylvania. Okay. Now, they also expand the right to vote in Pennsylvania. So if you're a man over the age of 21 and you've paid a shilling in taxes, you can vote in Pennsylvania. Or if you happen to be over 21 and you haven't paid taxes, but your father has, you can vote. Okay, we could spend the rest of the day saying how terrible this was because, you know, more than half of the people in the class wouldn't be able to vote in this situation because you're not men. And again, Haley, you'll be arguing for why this is a good thing not to, but this is actually more people are able to vote in Pennsylvania than in any other state or in England. Any guy over the age of 21 who's paid a shilling in taxes gets to vote. Most of the states did say in order to vote, you do need to own property. And this is saying you don't really need to, just pay a shilling in taxes and you can vote. And this expands the suffrage in Pennsylvania. That is, more people are able to vote than in any other place. And as I said, single house legislature that represents the general will of the population. Now, there is kind of an idea here too, that is it possible for any body that has power and represents what the people want, is it possible that the Virginia government could interfere with, well, let's say, take away property from people who may own property or do other things which could violate your rights? Is it possible that the Pennsylvania government, even though it represents the people, could do things that violate the interests of certain people in Pennsylvania? Is it possible that the people could be wrong? I mean, this is an interesting possibility. I don't want to say that you could be wrong, that a majority actually could do something wrong, particularly since it represents the people. And we've just gotten rid of the bad British government so that they're not going to constrain us. For example, well, let's suppose that, well, one of the important things that a state government needs to do is levy taxes, right? Because we're fighting a war and you're going to need to get money for this. And you're also going to need to get people into military service, particularly, and in Pennsylvania, it's kind of dicey because about a third of the people are Quakers who aren't going to go to war. And how do we go about, if you represent the majority, deciding who is going to pay for the various things the state may need? Who gets to decide on who pays taxes? Why don't we just take away the property that belongs to people who have too much? By the way, who here, maybe I should have just done this so you don't need to raise your hands. Who here is wealthy enough that if you owned a couple, who here owns more than, say, 2 houses? Anyone have any? I should have done this, Sarah, so you don't need to. Let me just see if I can have time to do this. I should have asked first. I'm going to create a poll if I can. Maybe not. Nope, not going to work. I apologize. And the dean's told me to stop asking you about your the state of your income. There always are going to be more people who don't have a lot of wealth than do. Okay, just fact of life. And so why don't we who represent the majority simply take away the property from those who have more than we do and distribute it among the rest of us? By the way, and I'm making an argument about something that happened in 1776. I'm not talking about today. I'm just talking hypothetically, 1776. Why don't those of us who represent the majority simply take away money from those who have too much and distribute it among the rest of us? Or who thinks that's a good idea? We can start with those who say, yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite like that, but yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That those of us who have the votes can simply take away the property from those who have it. Suddenly quiet there. Maybe, yes, Anthony.
I mean, I can't speak for I guess, the time, because we're taking into consideration the time when this is all happening. I mean, for me, at least principally, if someone has a lot of wealth, it for me, whether or not the wealth should be taken away or redistributed comes down to how they obtain the wealth. If they did it in a way that was ethical,
Okay.
And the fact is, a lot of wealthy people, at the time especially, were wealthy because of slavery. And slavery is the exploitation of people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that extreme of slavery, like literal, chattel slavery, people in chains, or people being, physically and sexually abused. It could even just be like wage slavery. So for me, that's how I see it. At least I know it was different back then, but
Okay. Thanks. Abigail?
I guess the people at the time who were making these policies were the ones who had most of the wealth and
Yeah.
more than one house in this situation. So they wouldn't want to take away their own property.
Okay, but then why are they creating a system where it is possible that can anyone imagine, maybe we got this sidetracked here. Can anyone imagine the circumstance under which a majority of the people would want to do something that actually violates the rights of a minority? No one can. Okay. Yes, V.
I would say for their own personal political or government gain.
Yeah. Okay.
And if they wanted to take away property, for me, well, if I'm looking back at that time, owning land was just as important as having people to work the land. So if you had more land, then you could probably use that land to corruptly negotiate with other territories or whatever, without anybody objecting.
Okay. Possibly. Yes. Paul?
Yeah, so this is kind of like an older example of how a majority took advantage of the minority and took away their rights. Under the Adams presidency, the Alien and Sedition Acts, because Adams was the executive officer and he controlled the Congress at that point, he passed acts to take away.
Well, actually, Congress did that. Let's
Right.
keep track who is doing what. Okay, and it's
Right,
easy to
right,
do
right.
the shorthand, but go on.
Right.
I
Yeah,
think you're on the
so
right track.
the Congress, who was under the same party, they didn't really have parties back then with the Adams administration passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which prevented people from speaking out against the government, which was
Okay.
a violation of rights.
Okay, so here you have Virginia, and the Virginia Constitution does have a Declaration of Rights, and everything is phrased as they do recognize that, yeah, a government could violate rights, but it says these rights ought not to be infringed. So there may be cases where maybe we need to. They ought not to, but maybe we need to. I think we've gotten a little sidetracked, and I meant to make it more clear here what it is that Pennsylvania is doing. You have a single House legislature. They do recognize that the majority might do things to infringe on the minority. So in a case like that, there are two things that would protect you from the state government doing something to violate your rights. One is no law will take effect until there's been another election. So let's suppose the legislature passes some law. We don't like it. We can vote out the legislature. The legislature is elected every year and vote in a new one. That's one safeguard. The other is every 7 years, the people of Pennsylvania can elect a council of revision. So let's just suppose, hypothetically, Paul is one of these people who has a huge estate, and so we need money for the legislature, so he simply sees his property. Okay, I think it's interesting. No one here can imagine that you may be in a position where you own property someday, which is a little alarming. I hope you are in a position to do that. So the legislature says, hey, you know what? We need Paul's property for something. And Paul says, well, wait a minute, don't I have the right to property? And they say, well, yeah, we ought not to take it away, but we really needed this. Well, if Paul is really upset, he can wait for 7 years when we appoint this council of revision and then take it up with a council of revision and say, hey, they ought not to have taken away my property. And then the council of revision may say, oh, you know what? You're right. Our bad. We shouldn't have taken your money away. Or they might not. Okay. So you have that protection in Pennsylvania. In 7 years, we'll elect a council of revision and they may change their mind. Does that satisfy you? I don't know if Paul can imagine a situation where he actually owns property like this. The state might be taking it away, since we've already decided that people with property are pretty bad because somehow they got it through doing something illicit. That at least was the tenor of the conversation so far. What do you think? Wait 7 years? Paul says no. He's moving somewhere else to get away from this. And by the way, John Adams. Yes, Matthew.
So I had a quick question regarding this. So while the states are forming their new constitutions, I understand most loyalists to the British Crown were not staying in the states. I
Yeah.
mean, some had stayed for sure, but surely these people would be in the minority eventually. And loyalist territory and property was seized almost immediately by the state government. So is this just considering the fact that you're basically representing a hostile power and not a constituent member of the state?
That's a very interesting question because, 1776, 1783, really unclear what's going to happen with these loyalists. And for the most part, you're right. Each state is saying, hey, we'll take their property because, they've left. Okay. But then something interesting happens. The treaty says that these people who have lost their property have to be compensated. So what happens between 1783 and the 1790s in each state, people are saying, hey, you know what, you're supposed to pay me. And the state government is saying, okay, we don't have to tax those who have remained loyal to us in order to pay off these folks who are on the other side. This is a big issue in the 1780s. What happens with the loyalists? You're right. At the moment, we can simply say, hey, we'll take away the loyalists' property. It's when they start actually taxing those who are on the patriot side that you have this problem. Pennsylvania doesn't really protect the interests of minorities of any kind because the majority is what is in power in Pennsylvania. Because the thinking is the majority can't do anything wrong. We do have a system where the majority governs, but how do we determine what the majority is or what particular issue is holding the majority together? Anyway, so Pennsylvania has a single house legislature. There is no check on the legislative branch because the legislature chooses the executive, and the legislature is answerable to the majority of the population. And it's a kind of a problem. How do you create a system where a majority governs, but the majority is not going to oppress the minorities? And we'll be talking about what makes for a minority interest versus a majority interest and who should govern. And we've done away with the system of the British system where you have the assembly pretty much representing the towns or the people in the particular colony. And then the British government has a somewhat different interest. So there can be that check, but we've done away with the check. How do you have a check within a system that is somehow going to prevent majority tyranny? If what you want to do is prevent majority tyranny, I don't know, maybe we should have taken a vote and seen if we support tyranny of the majority or having the majority govern. And then if you don't agree with that the majority should govern, the question becomes, well, then who should? Should it be a minority governing? I mean, these are all complicated questions that these folks are trying to resolve here as they're trying to do what Adams and Paine said, create the world over again. We have it in our power to begin the world anew. And no one's had this opportunity since the day of Noah or the greatest geniuses of antiquity. Okay, so Pennsylvania, very democratic, most democratic constitution of any state pretty much ever created, okay? The only one that does this, by the way. Other states want to have some kind of two-house legislature because there's kind of recognition that, the majority actually can do things that will oppress minorities. And how do you stop that? And again, we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about whether we should stop the majority. I suspect that if what the majority wants to do is something we all agree with, we're not going to have a problem with it. If, however, we are in the minority, how far do you want the majority to be able to take away our property, our liberty, etc.? Okay, couple of things here. One, in each of these cases, you have the state government being created essentially by the assembly that was in place before. You have in Virginia what had been the House of Burgesses. The governor of Virginia suspends the House of Burgesses. They keep meeting now as the provincial Congress, and they draw up a state government where essentially you still have a provincial Congress that's now acts as the assembly, and they'll still call it the House of Burgesses, and then you'll have an upper house, a council, and then a governor who is chosen by the assembly. So it looks very much like the old system, and other states do this. By the way, 3 states don't need to change their government. One is Delaware, and the 2 others are Rhode Island and Connecticut, because those states all had charters which don't mention the crown, and so they just simply go on doing what they have been doing. And Pennsylvania, they'd always had a system where the assembly chooses the governor, and the same governor you have in place in 1774. John Trumbull is governor throughout this period, and Rhode Island similarly. You don't have any real change. Rhode Island still has the same government that had been created in 1636. In other states where you have the governor, the king, the crown mentioned, they do need to make some kind of a change. And plus, there's this push. We have it in our power to create the world anew. Now, in New Hampshire, what they do is decide you can't simply have the old provincial assembly drawing up a constitution, and that constitution essentially makes the old provincial assembly the power here. Because that's simply saying, okay, the group that's in power decides what the government will be, and then they continue being in power. And in New Hampshire, they decide the way to choose the group that creates a constitution is to have a convention that represents the sovereign power of the people of New Hampshire. So that's what happens in New Hampshire. They have a state convention. And something interesting happens in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, you'll recall this is where the revolution began. And they said, okay, office of governor is vacant. 1776, no real problem. 1777, no real problems. But then people start saying, well, wait a minute. This government, the assembly, which had been suspended by the governor, now is acting as the provincial Congress. They are taxing us, also calling on us into military service. So if you're a man between the ages of 16 and 40, you're being basically told to serve in the Continental Army because we need to send a certain number of people off to fight the war. And Massachusetts is actually one of the best at sending people off to war, which might actually cause you to die. More likely you're going to die because of disease in one of the camps than in a battle. So you might start to wonder what gives this government the power to ask for your life or your money, because this old government is the one created under the British Crown. We no longer acknowledge the British Crown, but we still have this government operating. So long about toward the end of 1777, early 1778, people in Massachusetts are saying, why are we listening to this government that doesn't really have any legitimacy? We want a new government. And so the Massachusetts Assembly, elected in 1778, in fact, we elect a new government every April in Massachusetts. They say, okay, new government's elected, and this assembly says, here, we'll draw up a new constitution, which they do. And the new constitution looks very much like the old constitution. There is a legislature, and there's a council, and I think there's an executive. And then they say, okay, this is now the legitimate constitution. And once you in your town meetings vote for it, then we'll be able, as the new government, simply to tax you, call you into military service, and so on. And so in April of 1779, the people in their town meetings say, no, we don't agree to this constitution, because you can only have a constitution that drawn up by the sovereign power of the people of Massachusetts. You can't simply have this group that is the government saying, okay, we are now the government, and ratify this constitution and will continue being the government. So it's a philosophical argument they're making, that the created entity, the assembly, cannot also be the creator of its own power. That's a philosophical argument. Secondly, they also say, we thought a fundamental constitution should also address the problem of slavery. You know, in the months and years before independence, there had been a push in Massachusetts to do something about the institution of slavery. This new constitution simply says we're going to go on doing what we've always been doing. And much to the surprise of the assembly, the people of Massachusetts reject their constitution for a variety of reasons. One is the issue of slavery. The other is the issue of who creates a constitution. Can the creator be the created? And also there are certain things they thought the Constitution should have done, which this one doesn't. So what happens then in 1779, the Assembly calls for a convention. That is, the people of Massachusetts will elect a convention, and that convention doesn't have any other job than to come up with a constitution. And then it will be up to the people in the town meetings to determine whether or not they ratify it. So the Constitutional Convention is created in Massachusetts, and they meet over in Cambridge, and there are about 300 plus people at this convention. And one of them is John Adams, who happens to be home. He had come home from, he had been off in France as one of the American commissioners there, arrives in Braintree and is told, you've been elected to this convention. And so the convention, knowing that Adams has spent a lot of time thinking about government, appoints him to a committee to draw up a constitution. And then the committee appoints a subcommittee, which consists of John Adams, Samuel Adams, and James Bowdoin. And then Bowdoin and Samuel Adams put John Adams on the subcommittee to draw up a constitution, which Adams does. And then Adams goes back to Europe. The convention adopts this constitution, which is then submitted to a vote by the people in their town meetings. Now, Massachusetts has a government that is different from the other state governments in many ways. Like Virginia and other states, it begins with a Declaration of Rights. And I already read the first article about all men being free and equal and having certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights. The final article of the Declaration of Rights, there's 30 articles in the Declaration of Rights, says, in the government of this Commonwealth, the legislative department shall never exercise the executive and judicial power, or either of them. The executive shall never exercise the legislative and judicial powers, or either of them. The judicial shall never exercise the legislative and executive powers, or either of them. What does this mean? Yes, Matthew.
So basically it's laying out what powers and authority each branch of the government has, and they can't like swap roles. Like you can't have the executive proposing and enacting legislation, and you can't have the judicial branch enforcing anything. They all have to work with each other.
Yeah, it's mandating a separation of powers. And and then it ends by saying, to the end, it may be a government of laws and not of men. And the idea of a government of laws, not of men, that was the definition of a republic. That is, you don't say, okay, we'll just elect a bunch of people and they'll decide what to do and enforce the law. No, these are separate entities here. Okay, and then there is an assembly. All of these constitutions, by the way, begin with the legislative branch. That is the most important one because that's the branch that makes the laws. I say they begin with the form of government after a declaration of rights. That is why you have a government. So you have a lower house, and anyone who has an income of £3 every year, or an income or an estate valued at £60 can vote. So a shilling is what you had to pay in Pennsylvania in order to vote. In Massachusetts, you have to have an income of £3. That would be about £40 today. It's not insignificant, but it does allow for a lot of people to vote. And in order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you have to have an estate worth £100 in the town you represent. And every town will have one representative for every 150 people, essentially. So there's going to be several hundred people in this assembly, and there is a property qualification both for the voters, but also for the members of the assembly. Now, there is also a Senate, and the Senate, what Adams is trying to do with this Constitution is balance what he sees as the two big interests that are going to be fighting, those with property and those without property or less property. In any state, there are going to be more rich people than people who aren't rich. No one wanted to raise their hands and saying, yeah, I'm a rich person earlier. And the deans told me that, well, the dean has said, yeah, I should try to find out who is rich so that we can ask for the Haley Donovan building that we want to put in. So you have this constant argument going on between those with property and those with less property. So the Senate is supposed to represent property. In order to be a member of the Senate, you have to have an estate worth £600. Okay, so that's 6 times as much as, £100 would be about $40,000 today as your income. 6 times that is considerably more. But also, members of the House represent towns according to population. Members of the Senate are supposed to represent wealth, and we'll determine that each county will have a certain number of representatives based on the tax revenue they submit every year. So Essex County, which is where Salem is, and Suffolk County, which is where Boston is, each will have 8 senators. Berkshire County out in the west, Barnstable County, Bristol County, not quite as wealthy. They have fewer representatives. And as I said, there are going to be about 300 members of the House of Representatives. There are going to be 40 members of the Senate. So a smaller group that is supposed to represent property. So the Senate districts determined by tax levies, the Senate's going to represent property, and the governor is going to be different in Massachusetts than in other states. The governor is elected by a popular vote. Okay, this is no other state has the governor elected by a popular vote. New York actually has an electoral system to choose the governor. Each county sends votes for electors who then choose a governor. Massachusetts, popular vote. The governor also has to be really, really rich. The governor has to have an estate worth £1,000. And the governor also has the ability to veto laws that the assembly passes, something no other state does. And Adams's first draft, the governor has an absolute veto. The convention changes that so the legislature can override the governor's veto. And there also is a judiciary, a separate judiciary chosen by the governor. There's also a governor's council. There always was a council. They kind of keep it. There still to this day is a governor's council that approves or vetoes appointees to the judiciary. And so you have this government with a separation of powers, and each house representing a different interest. The middle class people and the richer people in the facing off in the House and the Senate. And then the executive and the judiciary not being beholden to each other, but checking each other. So this is one of the important things about the Massachusetts Constitution, which also, as I said, begins with this Declaration of Rights. And we can talk more about that. But then there are other things in this Constitution which are interesting. By the way, the Massachusetts Constitution is the oldest written constitution still functioning in the world. We've taken out the property qualification, the religious requirement, but this essentially is the same structure of government, and it is the only one from this period that has survived. Okay, so this is Chapter 5, Section 2. Chapter 5, Section 1 deals with the university at Cambridge. And then Section 2 says, wisdom and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. And as these depend on spreading the opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people, it shall be the duty of legislatures and magistrates in all future periods of the Commonwealth to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences, and all seminaries of them, especially the University at Cambridge, public schools and grammar schools in the towns, to encourage private societies and public institutions, rewards and immunities for the promotion of agriculture, art, sciences, commerce, trades, manufactures, and a natural history of the country, to countenance and inculcate the principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry and frugality, honesty and punctuality in their private dealings, sincerity, good humor, and all social affections and generous sentiments among the people. What do you make of this? Yes, Matthew.
So Massachusetts is basically saying that it's the duty and responsibility of the government to promote and advance education for the state.
Yeah, good. And anyone else know why this is? Does he say why this is important? And for whom is education important? Or is it self-explanatory? I mean, Matthew did a very good job of just saying what it says, which is that it's the responsibility to foster education. And it's not just the university in Cambridge, which is accepting a very small number of people, but the grammar schools and public schools in all the towns, in order to foster virtue and all of these other things. It's another unique thing. And it's, again, as with saying, you know, all men are free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, why are you making this argument? Why is it we're taking this opportunity to say that this is a responsibility of the Commonwealth? And also, Massachusetts also is going to be a Commonwealth. And the whole thing begins by saying that the end of the institution, maintenance, and administration of government is to secure the existence of the body politic, to protect it, and to furnish the individuals who compose it with the power of enjoying in safety and tranquility their natural rights and the blessings of life. And whenever these great objects are not obtained, the people have a right to alter the government and to take measures necessary for their safety, prosperity, and happiness. So you're making this assertion about why you have a government here. So Pennsylvania is making a similar argument about government and saying, okay, now we don't have to listen to the Quakers and to the Loyalists, so we'll create a government that represents a majority of those who are still here. In Massachusetts, you're creating this government where these different interests will check each other, but recognizing that there is an imperative to foster education, and not just the handful of people who are going to go to Harvard, but everyone in the towns. It's, by the way, as with many of these things, it's not going to be an immediate, hey, let's create public schools, but it is the reason why Massachusetts is going to have a public school system, and why, if you go to the stand in front of the State House, you'll see there's a statue of Horace Mann there, who's the father of public education, because of this Constitution that sets up this system. Okay. And our friend, well, maybe he's not your friend, since when we were talking about him earlier, Paul brings up the Alien and Sedition Act. A number of years ago, I was actually, the Adams houses in Quincy were asking, what can we do to improve the way we tell our story? And one of the people there was a woman, lovely woman named Abigail, who was a descendant of the Adamses. And she said, ever since I was in 3rd grade, people have been throwing the Alien and Sedition Acts in my face. We'll get to the Alien and Sedition Acts before the end of the semester. I'm glad Paul brought them up because interesting thing. Okay, so we have these two kind of different constitutions, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, trying to create the world anew. You know, thinking about what it is these different characters are doing and what is the role of government and what's the best way to form a government. And it's really something happening in each of the states. So it's something to keep in mind and think about. On Wednesday, we'll be having a quiz, and this might come up. Just thinking about the nature of government, thinking about Payne and Adams and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. So we'll be talking about that. We'll also probably talk about the Articles of Confederation and other things. Are there any questions? I mean, I'm just warming up. I didn't think I was going to make it for an hour and 15 minutes, but now I think I'm going to sit here for the rest of the afternoon talking about this. But I know you probably have lives to get to, so I will let you go.
Have a good day, Professor.
Take care.
Thank you,
Good to see you all.
Professor.
Good to see you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Professor, I had a question
Yes, Paul.
about the primary source stuff.
Yes.
So I don't know if you saw my email.
I can't remember if